I've entitled my talk today, Yosef, Shlomo, and Hanukkah. Today's Torah portion, today's Parsha, is Genesis 41, verse 1 through 44, verse 17. In Hebrew, the Parsha is called Miketz, which means at the end, referring to the verse which says, at the end of 2 years, Pharaoh had a dream. Now, those 2 years refer to the 2 years that Yosef was still in prison after the cupbearer had been released, and he had previously spoken to Yosef about his dreams. This Shabbat is special because it is also the Shabbat of Hanukkah. So Pharaoh had a dream of 7 fat, well-nourished cows that came up out of the river. They began grazing. Then 7 malnourished cows came up, real thin, bad-looking cows, and they devoured the 7 fat cows. Pharaoh woke up, apparently disturbed by his dream. Then he fell back asleep, and he dreamt again, this time of 7 ripe, full ears of grain. Then 7 thin, wind-damaged ears of grain sprang up from the earth, and they swallowed the full ears of grain. These dreams disturbed Pharaoh sufficiently that he called on his wise men, his sorcerers, his magicians, and asked them to interpret the dreams. Now, the scripture says that none of them were able to. I suspect none of them were able to give him a satisfying or meaningful interpretation of the dreams. Then his chief cupbearer, who was nearby, said to Pharaoh, "Hey, I remember this guy who was in prison with me when I was locked up, and he interpreted dreams for me and the chief baker, and he interpreted those correctly. Mine said I was going to be released and come back into your service." So Pharaoh said, "Well, bring him to me." So they immediately brought Joseph to Pharaoh. The Torah says that Joseph shaved and got cleaned up. The Egyptians were always clean-shaven. The Israelites typically wore beards. So they brought Joseph to Pharaoh, clean clothes, shaven, and Pharaoh said, "I understand you can interpret dreams." And Yosef said to him in Genesis 41:16, Yosef answered Pharaoh, "It isn't in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer that will set his mind at peace." So Yosef was giving all of the glory to God, making it clear to Pharaoh that God was giving him the meaning of dreams. He had just come out of prison after 13 years of being locked up for a crime that he didn't commit. Yet he was not bitter. Now, some people, maybe most people, would be angry at God or angry at the man or at the government. Here Yosef was, standing in front of the head of the government, the Pharaoh himself, and he didn't gripe, he didn't express bitterness. And by the way, had the cupbearer remembered Joseph 2 years earlier, he would have been sprung from prison 2 years earlier. But he would not have been standing in front of Pharaoh at this point. He might have gone on his way and who knows what. But that's not what God had in mind. Because God delayed his being released from prison, delayed the cupbearer remembering Yosef until this point so that Yosef could initiate all of the events that follow, including Yosef's family coming down to Egypt and Bnei Israel, the children of Israel, spending the next 400 years there. This wasn't a timeshare, by the way, and everything that followed. So Yosef remained in prison. His remaining in prison for those 2 years was crucial for God's plan. His lack of bitterness and his lack of anger is striking in light of everything he had been through. Think of his life. He had been betrayed by his brothers, who considered killing him, but then came up with a compromise and only sold him into slavery. Then, while working in the house of Potiphar, an official of Pharaoh, he was falsely accused by Potiphar's wife of sexual assault, and she was believed, so he was imprisoned. Then the cupbearer, whom Yosef had asked, please remember me upon your release and see if you can speak favorably of me so I can be released. He had forgotten all about him for 2 years. That would be enough to make most of us bitter. But Yosef was apparently not bitter, and he was not apparently suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. Yosef explained to Pharaoh that his dreams meant that there would be 7 good years of crops and abundance, followed by a 7-year famine. Pharaoh was told that the dream was doubled because God had decided this was definitely going to happen. This was like underlining it, putting it all in capital letters. If God were sending him this message, he would have put it in an email, he would have put it in italics, and in bold lettering. So, hence the double dream. He said to Pharaoh, you need to put somebody in charge, and you need to gather crops during those good years. In fact, he suggested a 20% tax, 20% of the crops. And Pharaoh said, well, that's a pretty good idea. And then he said, I'll put you in charge. You seem like a bright young fella. So Yosef, who was now 30 years old, was now suddenly in charge of, basically, he was second in command of Egypt. He was also rewarded by Pharaoh with a wife, the daughter of somebody named Potiphera. You recall that the woman who caused Yosef's imprisonment was the wife of Potiphar. Now, there are some questions as to whether this Potiphera and that Potiphar are this one and the same. I don't know. But if it was the same person, what a touch of irony that was. Potiphar's wife tries to seduce Yosef. He rebuffs her. She then accuses him of assault and sends him to prison. And years later, her daughter is given in marriage to Yosef. Well, Yosef and his wife had 2 sons. Genesis 41:50-52 reads, 2 sons were born to Yosef before the year of famine came. Osnath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, bore them to him. Yosef called the first one Manasseh. Manasseh means, or Manasseh in English, causing to forget. And he said, because God has caused me to forget all the troubles I suffered at the hands of my family. The second he called Ephraim, which means double fruit, or fruitfulness. For God has made me fruitful in the land of my misfortune, an abundance of fruitfulness. In these verses, we see how Yosef overcame the risk of developing or suffering PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. First of all, he says, God has made me forget, caused me to forget all the troubles. But if you're referring to the troubles, did you really forget them? You didn't forget them. Saying, hey, I forgot all about it. Well, if you forgot all about it, you're not mentioning it. No, he didn't forget. He didn't have amnesia about it. He didn't have blackouts. Here he was speaking of it. He had chosen willingly to give it up with God's help, to give it to God, turn it over to God. We'll see later that he also forgave his brothers. And this helps. If you forgive your attacker, it is easier to hold on to bitterness and anger. In fact, I read an article yesterday about a program in which they have people who are crime victims meet with their attackers in an attempt to resolve some of the pain. Having his own sons, as Yosef had done by this point, also helps, would assist in his healing, as he was now again in a father-son relationship, in a family relationship. But most importantly, God had healed him. As he reminds us, and reminds himself in naming Ephraim his second son, which means twice fruitful or fruitfulness, He now had 2 sons, and he had gone from being hopelessly incarcerated to being something equivalent to being the vice president of Egypt. Yosef had been a pioneer in that he had a lot of firsts. He established and ran the first food bank in recorded history. He was the first person in recorded history to fall victim to the Me Too movement, long before Duke University's lacrosse players were ever accused. And, of course, he went to jail on those false accusations. He was the first recorded case of presidential pardon, or in this case, Pharaohic pardon, long before Hunter. Meanwhile, back at the famine, the famine also affected neighboring lands, so that Jacob, and his family were suffering as well. Now, Yaakov had been preoccupied with the losses that he had experienced. First, Yosef had been taken from him, and his brothers said, well, we think a wild animal must have slain him, because they brought him the coat. Then he had lost his most beloved of his wives, Rachel. So he seems now, all of a sudden, to become acutely aware of the famine. And he said to his sons in Genesis 42, verses 1 and 2, now Yaakov saw there was grain in Egypt, so Yaakov said to his sons, why are you staring at each other? Look, he said, I've heard there's grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some from us from there, so we can stay alive and not die. So things must have been pretty dire. Circumstances must have been pretty dire. He's talking about dying. Now, his family had been racked by difficulties, by scandal and turmoil. There had been Yehuda and Tamar. There was the rape of Dinah, then the violent retribution for that by Shimon and Levi, who had slaughtered the men of Shechem. You might wonder if maybe Yaakov had said to his sons, you boys are grounded. Okay, all right. You got to be in by 9 p.m. Street lights come on, you're in. Or at least, if not grounded, strongly advised by their father not to make any independent decisions, certainly not any rash decisions, without running them by him at first. Genesis 42:3 tells us, thus, Yosef's 10 brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt. Now, in 42:1, Yosef's 10 brothers were referred to as Jacob's sons, Yaakov's sons. 2 verses later, they're referred to as Joseph's brothers. Why the change in terminology? I don't believe that God just chooses words carelessly or randomly. 10 brothers went down. Notice Benjamin did not go because Yaakov feared losing him, his only remaining son from Rachel. But the terminology change, I think, has to do with the fact that when it says Yaakov's sons, it implies in verse 1 that Yaakov was still running things. He was the head of the family. He was going to make the decisions, especially in light of the past behavior of his sons. Now, it suggests that just like Yosef had been sold into slavery and had gone through terrible hardships, his brothers were, God is reminding us that these are his brothers who are now facing danger in their own journey. They're traveling all the way to Egypt during desperate times. Remember, these were difficult times for everyone. There was famine. And so if you saw a caravan of people going, you might want to rob them. Maybe they've got food. Maybe they don't have food. Maybe they have money to buy food. And then you can buy food. So they were going through some dangerous areas. And of course, Yosef, we know that Yosef had ended up in Egypt. They didn't know that. They didn't even know that he was still alive. And now they were going into Egypt for the survival of their families. They had no idea who they were going to have to deal with. And they certainly had no idea that they would have to deal directly, face to face, with the brother whom they had betrayed and sold into slavery, and who had told them prior to that of his dream of them someday having to bow to him. Now, it turns out, they would have to seek his grace and his mercy for their sustenance. So they came before Yosef, and he recognized them, but he didn't reveal his identity to them, and he didn't reveal that he recognized them. Instead, he questioned them. Who are you? Are you spies? Crossed the border illegally? You see, they came over the southern border, and they were undocumented. He suggested they remain in custody while one of them would travel home to bring their youngest brother, because they, in questioning, they said, well, we have a father and we have one more brother. And he said, how do I know you're telling me the truth? All right, one of you can go home, bring him back here, and then I'll believe your story. Otherwise, I think you're spies. In reality, he wanted to be reunited with Benjamin, who, when he left, had been a very young child, his full brother, Benjamin. So let's look at Genesis 42, 17 and 18. Then he put all of them together in prison for 3 days. Now, he did this because if you sent one back, he was certainly much more vulnerable to being attacked. So he put one in prison. He put them together in prison for 3 days. On the third day, he said to them, do what I say and stay alive, for I fear God. Ultimately, he's going to release 9 of them and keep one. 3 days. Why 3 days? We ever hear of 3 days elsewhere in scriptures? Okay. A rabbinical commentary notes with regard to this that God doesn't subject a righteous man to more than 3 days of trial or difficulty, or more than 3 days in a tomb, I suppose. Hosea has something to say about this as well. In Hosea 6:2, he's talking about returning to Adonai, and he says, after 2 days he will revive us. On the third day he will raise us up, and he will live, and we will live in his presence. This, of course, is also a messianic prophecy. And when the rabbis talk about the third day with regard to Yosef and imprisoning his brothers, they're blind to the greater significance of this 3-day lockup of Yosef, of Yaakov's sons, and it's indicative of it's prophesying the future 3 days that Yeshua would spend in the tomb. After 3 days, Yosef told them that he would keep one of them in custody while the others returned home to fetch their youngest brother. It would have, as I said, it would have been unwise for any one to travel alone, as he originally suggested to them. He kept Shimon in custody. Now, why Shimon? Perhaps because he had been the most violent of the brothers, or because he and Levi together had committed that heinous violence of murdering all the men of Shechem. And this would separate him and Levi, lest they harm Benjamin as they had Yosef. In Genesis 42:21, the text reveals something that we had not seen earlier. They said to each other, we are in fact guilty concerning our brother. He was in distress and he pleaded with us. We saw it and we wouldn't listen. That's why this distress has come upon us now. So they now have matured. They've got some feelings of guilt and remorse. We're guilty. And it also reveals, it says, he was in distress and he pleaded with us. In the account where they threw Yosef in the pit, we're not told that he pleaded with them. Okay? Which only elaborates, adds to the picture of their cruelty at that point. Now they are different people than they were then. We're beginning to see that. They now admit they had heard his pleas and had shown him no mercy, and they realize that God has now brought distress to them. They returned home. They told their father that they had been ordered to take Benjamin back with them. However, Yaakov, being so protective over his youngest son from his beloved late wife Rachel, He feared losing Binyamin forever, as he had Yosef. He had had a series of losses, and certainly from that branch of his family. Look at the family dynamics at play here. Same as when Yosef was a lad at home. He was favored. Now Binyamin was favored. He was Binyamin, the second son by Jacob's most beloved wife, Rachel, is favored. Yaakov clearly showed his favoritism of his sons by Rachel over the other 10 sons. And it would be hard for them not to be jealous, not to have had some difficulty with that. But they responded differently now regarding Binyamin than they had years earlier regarding Yosef. Again, we see evidence that they have matured. As they have to bring Binyamin with them, they now discuss the logistics of caring for him. Genesis 42, 37 and 38 reads, Reuben said to his father, if I don't bring him back to you, you can kill my own 2 sons. Reuben is an intellectual giant, isn't he? Put him in my care, I will return him to you. But he replied, that is, Yaakov replied, my son will not go down with you. His brother is dead, and he alone is left. He alone is left? Again, that's kind of striking. What are the rest of them? Chopped liver? If anything were to happen to him while traveling with you, you would bring my gray hair down to Sheol with grief. This is a very odd offer that Reuben made, okay? Think of this. Now, Reuben he's a grown man. He has sons of his own. He's saying to his father, you can kill those 2 boys, your grandsons, if I don't bring Binyamin, back to you. Does he think this is going to be reassuring or comforting to his father, the grandfather of the 2 boys? I don't think so. Now, this is the last time Reuben is seen in the Torah as a family spokesperson. Subsequently, Yehuda took on that role. As sons 2 and 3 were out of the running, Shimon was being held captive in Egypt, and both he and Levi had discredited themselves by killing all the males of Shechem. Now, nevertheless, Yaakov delayed sending them until they were pretty much running out of food again. Story picks up in Genesis 43 and concludes in 44:17. I'm not going to go through all of it, but I would recommend, if you haven't read it recently, read 43 through 44:17. The details, the raw human emotion that is experienced by Yosef when he meets Binyamin, and every part of that is as powerful and as compelling as anything you might see in any television or movie drama. Next, I'd like to speak a little bit about the Haftorah reading for today, which was 1 Kings 3:15-4:1. Actually, you guys read a different one. Yeah. In these verses, King Solomon, Shlomo in Hebrew, whose name means peace, by the way, having awakened from a dream in which God spoke to him and gave him, he's awakened from a dream in which God spoke to him and gave him a wise and discerning heart. His wisdom is then demonstrated in the verses that follow. 2 women, we're told they're both prostitutes, come before him as they're each claiming that a disputed infant is hers. Both the dream and Shlomo's wisdom connect this reading to the Torah portion. Think of Yosef's dreams and his understanding of dreams, as well as his wisdom in solving the famine problem for Egypt. Shlomo's name, as I said, comes from the word shalom, peace. He was a man of peace. He made peace treaties with many surrounding neighboring kingdoms, and during his reign as king, Israel was at peace with its neighbors. Yet, while his father was a great David was a great king who kept Israel safe by defeating enemies in battle, Shlomo had a different manner of keeping the peace. He married the daughters of all the neighboring kings, thus making peace with them. You see, if your daughter is one of the queens or princesses and you have grandkids there, you're not likely to attack that kingdom. So as a result, he had 700 wives. Oh yeah, and 300 concubines. He seems to have made peace this way with every king who had a marriageable daughter. He also acquired many horses and chariots from Egypt and became somewhat of a dealer in horses. I can imagine this lot. Shlomo's used horses, low mileage, and chariots. He probably made a tidy profit buying and selling horses and chariots. Sounds like a good deal. 700 wives, 300 concubines, a lot dealing in horses. Wait a minute, not so much, not such a good deal. Because recall that in Deuteronomy, in Devarim 17, verses 16 and 17, Moshe, told the people what criteria Adonai had set with regard to them having a king. He's describing that, and then he says in these verses, however, he is not to acquire many horses for himself or have the people return to Egypt to obtain more horses, inasmuch as Adonai has told you never go back that way again. And that's the first thing that, of course, where was he getting his horses? From Egypt. Likewise, he is not to acquire many wives for himself, so that his heart will not turn away, and he is not to acquire excessive quantities of silver and gold. He didn't mention cryptocurrency, though. God knew, of course, that wives from foreign nations who worshipped pagan gods could turn a king away from Adonai. And this is exactly what happened with Shlomo subsequently, later on in life. He loved God, he loved Adonai, he built the temple, but he became distracted and trying to satisfy and please these wives. He started building temples to pagan gods. Did he never pay attention to what it said in Devarim? A king was supposed to write a Torah himself and to read it daily. Shlomo's father David wrote in Psalm 20, verse 7, Tehillim 20, verse 7, some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we praise the name of Adonai, our God. But I suspect that Shlomo at this point did not have a whole lot of time for reading, so maybe he forgot about that or missed it. The two prostitutes who came before him lived in the same house. Both had birthed sons, apparently on the same day. And as they slept, one rolled over onto her son, and he died of suffocation. Then she switched babies with the other woman and said, oh no, the dead one is yours, this one is mine. So they came before the king. Now, it was common in those days for if you had a dispute with someone else in the kingdom, to come before the king himself. And the king would, being a wise man, or supposedly a wise man, would offer a solution or judge the case. So he was to decide the first child custody case in recorded history. He tested their hearts by calling for his sword, suggesting that he could slice the infant in half, and each could have half an infant. Then one woman, obviously the real mother, said, no, don't do that. Just give the baby to the other woman. That way, the baby will live. Shlomo, recognized by her loving willingness to give up her infant so he could live, that she was the true mother, so he awarded the child to her. Now, the idea of two prostitutes coming before the king might have raised a few eyebrows. In this manner, Shlomo, though, was like our Messiah, Yeshua, who was willing to minister even to the lowliest and worst sinner. Yeshua didn't merely solve their problems, but also brought them to the Lord and away from their sinful ways, whereas all Shlomo did was solve their problems. So this section wraps up with the following. 1 Kings 3:28 says, all Israel heard of the decision the king had made and held the king in awe, for they saw that God's wisdom was in him, enabling him to render justice properly. And again, it wasn't his wisdom, much like Yosef had said, it's not my wisdom to interpret these, God's giving me this. This also helps us to understand how Solomon made some poor decisions later in life when building temples for all of those gods of his wives. You see, at that point, God's wisdom, maybe the Ruach HaKodesh, was no longer with him. And when the Ruach is not in you, you are more likely to fall prey to bad decisions. I'd like to next look at 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 1 through 5, where the issue of wisdom is further discussed. In 1 Corinthians 2:1, we see Paul, Shaul, saying, as for me, brothers, when I arrived among you, it was not with surpassing eloquence or wisdom that I came announcing to you the previously concealed truth about God. He's saying, I didn't come with wisdom, certainly not my own wisdom, or any wisdom that arose from within me. The wisdom he offered in Corinth was the word of God. In Corinth had some real difficulties when Shaul went there. There were apparently many preachers who had divided and defiled the local community of believers. Corinth was the Las Vegas of its time, Sin City. And the church leaders permitted it or gave a blind eye to it. In fact, in ancient times, if you really wanted to seriously insult someone, you would call him a Corinthian. Everybody knew what that meant. If somebody calls you a Corinthian, they're saying you're the lowest of the low. You're a sinner. If you want to read a further description of the sinful ways of Corinth, read Romans 1:18-32. Shaul wrote Romans while in the city of Corinth, and I imagine him looking out a window at the goings-on the streets. Perhaps might be reminiscent of parts of New York City today, Midtown Manhattan, the South Bronx, where you see God knows what. At any rate, 1 Corinthians 2:3-4 continues. Shaul goes on to say, also, I myself was with you as somebody weak, nervous, and shaking over from fear, and neither the delivery nor the content of my message relied on compelling words of wisdom, but on a demonstration of the power of the Spirit. He was reminding them of his humanness, his frailty. He says, I'm nervous and shaking. I'm just a humble servant of Yeshua. I'm relying on the power of the Ruach HaKodesh. In his phrase, demonstration of the power of the Spirit, the word translated from the Greek as demonstration means legal proof. Legal proof is indisputable proof. It means the court has ruled that this is the case. This is true. The result of Shaul's teaching was that the Ruach changed lives, and demonstration of that served further as legal proof of the Ruach's power. There was eyewitness testimony. In 1 Corinthians 2, verse 5, he adds, so that your trust might not rest on human wisdom, but on God's power. He's saying, trust in God, not in men. God's power, not the power of men or of principalities. I want to go on to talk a little bit about Hanukkah. John 2:22-23, Yochanan 10, verses 22-23, is the only place in Scriptures, Old or New, where Hanukkah is mentioned. Then came Hanukkah in Yerushalayim. It was winter, and Yeshua was walking around inside the temple area in Shlomo's colonnade. Now, if you're reading King James, New King James, most of the probably, I think maybe all of the Christian Bibles, it doesn't say Hanukkah. It says Feast of Dedication. Okay? And Hanukkah, as, what is her name? Elise, who was on the video? Is that right? As she said on the video, Hanukkah means dedication or rededication. Okay? So they kind of buried the fact that it's a Jewish holiday being mentioned in the New Covenant, but it is, and Yeshua celebrated it. When he was there, the Judeans said to him, if he was the Mashiach, he should no longer keep them in suspense, but should declare himself. And in Yochanan 10, 25 and 26, it reads, Yeshua answered them, I've already told you, and you don't trust me. The works I do in my Father's name testify on my behalf. Again, testimony, wisdom. But the reason you don't trust me is you're not included among my sheep. Like Shaul in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, Yeshua was saying his words and his works, his miracles, demonstrated or proved that he is the Mashiach, the son of Elohim, Ben Elohim. Judeans who disbelieved, they didn't believe him because they were not his sheep. God's people are referred to as sheep, starting with David using that terminology in Psalms. The Lord is my shepherd in 23. Sheep are considered clean animals, and they will faithfully follow their shepherd. If we are God's sheep, we faithfully will follow him. Why did Yochanan in 10:22-23 tell us that it was the Feast of Dedication? He could have just said, then Yeshua was in Yerushalayim, it was winter, and he was walking around inside the temple area in Shlomo's colonnade. Why did he mention that it was the Feast of Dedication, the Feast of Hanukkah? Again, I don't think anything in Scriptures, old or new, is there by chance, or just because the editor said you need to pad it with more words. The only conclusion that I can come to is that Yochanan knew that Hanukkah was significant. Now, this was probably in the year 33 or 32 AD. About 196 years prior to this, 164, 165 AD, Judah Maccabee, had rededicated the temple after it had been desecrated by the Greek Seleucid Empire. A revolt had been led by the Maccabeans, led initially by Yehudah's father Mattathias and Mattathias' 5 sons. While the story of Maccabees is not in the Tanakh, the Old Testament, as it occurred after the final compilation of the Tanakh, it is recorded in secular history and in the book of Maccabees. There are several books of the Maccabees, the first 2 of which, ironically, are in the Catholic Bible. Go figure. Now, what does the name Maccabee mean? We're told that it means hammer. It may have been the Greek name of this family. They may have been named Maccabeus, but it also forms an acrostic which glorifies Adonai. In Hebrew, the acrostic reads, do you have that up on the screen? Can you put that up? Oh, it is up. Okay. Mi kamocha ba'elim Adonai. Okay. Maccabees. Who is like thee among the gods, O Lord? And it is said that as the Maccabees went into battle, they recited that phrase from the Tanakh, Mi kamocha ba'elim Adonai. Now you have to remember, this was a motley group, okay? And I will compare it, by the way, to the Israelis who fought their War of Independence in 1948. These were not people with formal military training. They had not been trained into cohesive platoons and divisions, regiments, and so on. And they were fighting armies. Similarly, here, the Maccabees were just a motley group A lot of people joined them who believed in their cause, but these were not militarily trained people. In fact, they probably were not exactly tough guys. They were more likely people of the book. They had been, Mattathias was a priest in his community. They were probably training to be, to take over the priestly duties in their community. Okay? More time in books than in the gym. So, Hanukkah is unlike the Moadim in the Torah in that work is not prohibited on Hanukkah. It's not treated like a Shabbat. Originally, Hanukkah was celebrated more as a political holiday, kind of like we celebrate Independence Day. The Pharisees turned it into a spiritual holiday, focusing on the miracle of the oil, which, by the way, is not mentioned in the book of the Maccabees. This miracle is found, however, in the Talmudic discussion of Hanukkah. Perhaps the 8 days is because without the temple, they couldn't properly celebrate the Moadim. Now, here it is, late fall or early winter, they could finally celebrate Sukkot, the 8 days of Sukkot, which they had not been, of tabernacles, which they had not been able to celebrate properly earlier. Yes, they might have been able to celebrate it in their community, but the commandment is go up to the temple in Jerusalem. Now the temple was being rededicated. Recall, by the way, that Shlomo's original temple was dedicated on Sukkot. 2 Maccabees 10:6, which you'll find in your Catholic Bible, reads, "And they celebrated for 8 days with joy in the manner of the Feast of Tabernacles, remembering that a little time before they had celebrated the solemn days of the Feast of Tabernacles in mountains and caves in the manner of wild beasts." First Maccabees and Second Maccabees are two distinct historical descriptions of the events leading up to the Maccabean victory over the Seleucid rulers. And I would encourage you to read those. It appears that certain Jewish leaders had suggested becoming more like the Gentiles, assimilating to the pagan ways, celebrating the pagan holidays, and even giving up circumcision, or, even more radically, reversing circumcision. Now, that process, some people say, is more painful than the original circumcision. It is known as epispasm. The very thought of it can cause spasm. Eventually, there were groups of Jewish rebels, some of whom refused to do battle on Shabbat, and they died as a result. But the patriarch of the Maccabees, Mattathias, over whom Matthew, the first gospel, is named, opined that fighting a defensive war on Shabbat was permissible. And this was a defensive war. They were fighting for their survival. They fought not only against the forces of Antiochus IV, but against Jewish assimilationists. But that part of the story is often brushed over, as the descendants of the defeated Jewish assimilationist group would hardly want to celebrate. Instead, the focus is on the miracle of the oil. While the accuracy or veracity of the events of the Old Testament, and therefore the origins of the Moadim, are often questioned by atheists and non-believers, some people say Yeshua didn't even exist. The historical record of the events leading up to Hanukkah, including the Maccabean revolt, are well documented by historians. As we were told earlier, after Alexander the Great died without an heir, his kingdom was divided among his 4 generals, and there was a portion that involved Egypt and Syria, and of course, little Israel was in between Egypt and Syria. Those were 2 different kingdoms. The Syrian kingdom was the one that Antiochus ends up with. So those controlling Egypt and those controlling Syria often fought wars with one another, and Israel was right in the middle. Not a good place to be, being caught in crossfire. It was the Ptolemaic and the Seleucid dynasties. So it was a frequent battlefield. Now, the Seleucid or Syrian king Antiochus IV was the ruler at the time of the Maccabean revolt. He was a modest guy. He named himself full name, Antiochus Theos Epiphanes. Antiochus, the living God, the visible God. His opponents, as we were told, called him Antiochus Epimanes, play on words. Antiochus the madman is what that means. Sounds a bit like the name-calling that occurs in modern political campaigns, doesn't it? While in a bad mood after a military defeat in Egypt, Antiochus, while retreating back to Syria, stopped over in Israel and decided once and for all he would get the Jews in line with worshiping the Greek gods. So he desecrated the temple. He put up a likeness of his own face in the temple to be worshipped, and he had a pig sacrificed in the temple. Remember, pigs are not kosher. They're unclean animals. And the pig's blood sprinkled in the Holy of Holies. He banned Jewish religious practices. He banned saying the Shema. He banned temple worship. He banned circumcision. He sent troops from village to village enforcing those rules. Well, when they got to the village of Modi'in, 17 miles from Jerusalem, the Kohen there, Mattathias, refused to sacrifice a pig there in their synagogue. Another priest, an apostate priest, trying to say, hey, we'll just do it. We'll play along with them. He was willing to sacrifice the pig, and Mattathias was so enraged he grabbed the Syrian officer's sword, stabbed the apostate priest, stabbed the officer, his sons standing nearby, then overwhelmed the other Syrian troops. And the rebellion was on. Now, this war lasted 3 years, and it is truly a miracle that it culminated in a Maccabean victory, a victory of a ragtag group of people. Again, I'm comparing it to 1948, against a well-armed, well-trained, battle-hardened army. But it culminated in the Maccabean victory and the rededication of the temple. In modern Israel, Hanukkah is often celebrated with marathon runners starting at Modi'in and running the 17 miles to Yerushalayim with a lighted torch on the evening of Hanukkah, culminating with lighting the great menorah at the Western Wall. The modern celebration of Hanukkah emphasizes decorating and gift giving. That is, as far as I know, something that began in mid-20th century. And this developed in response to Jewish children being envious of their non-Jewish peers. After all, their non-Jewish peers, their Christian peers, were getting Christmas gifts delivered by an obese elderly gentleman with a fetish for reindeer and red snowsuits. The Jewish kids would be told, hey, they have 1 day of Christmas, but we'll give you gifts for 8 days. You have 8 days of Hanukkah. Now, when I was a kid, I went through this, and I felt pretty good about 8 days of Hanukkah until I heard about the 12 days of Christmas. And I said, darn, foiled again. So why was Hanukkah significant to Yeshua? Antiochus was an unwitting agent of the adversary, and he was attempting to destroy the Jewish faith, Jewish practice. And that would have prevented Yeshua from being able to come. Of course, God wouldn't allow that. We know that. Without the struggle and victory led by Mattathias and his 5 sons, Mattatyahu and his 5 sons, and remember, God directed that, God used them, but had that not occurred, Jewish worship could have been wiped out. Antiochus was an idolater, and Adonai hates idolatry. Hanukkah celebrates the defeat of idolatry. Yeshua loved being at the temple in Jerusalem. Recall that as a child, he remained behind at the temple without his parents' awareness after they started their journey back home one Passover. In Luke 2, verse 49, he responded to his parents' relieved admonishment of him with the following. He said to them, why did you have to look for me? Didn't you know I had to be concerning myself with my Father's affairs or my Father's work? Hanukkah was all about saving Yeshua's Father's house. I would suggest that since Yeshua celebrated Hanukkah, and because it was obviously important to him, Christians should do so as well as Jews. Had Antiochus been successful in Hellenizing the world and stamping out all other faiths than the worship of Greek gods, including himself, of course, there would have been no Judaism and for Yeshua to be born into, and hence no Christianity and no Christmas. And then what would retailers do who often rely on Christmas to turn a losing year into a profitable one? Satan was at work in Antiochus's mind, trying to stamp out the root of Jesse. But God is faithful. The 4 letters in the dreidel, the top that children often spin, sometimes adults, in a game played on Hanukkah, represent the 4 words, Nes Gadol Haya Sham. Nes means a miracle, Gadol means great, Haya, occurred or happened or was, there, Sham is there. So a great miracle happened there. I won't go into the details of how to play the game, but the actual miracle of Hanukkah may have been God's intervention against the forces of the adversary to keep Judaism alive so that Yeshua would arrive and begin his ministry and make salvation from sin available to believers. Hanukkah represents a great miracle, the rededication of the temple, and it is commemorated with lights because the miracle involved holy oil being able to keep the eternal light, the eternal lamp lit for 8 days until new oil could be made and be made pure for temple worship. Yeshua, of course, is the light of the world, and he will reestablish temple worship. Shabbat Shalom and Happy Hanukkah.